All right. Good morning and welcome to the call. Super grateful that you're all here this morning. So, I was going to take a minute today to talk about narcissism. Now, some of you may have heard me talk about narcissism before. I like to start with my take on the current conversation around narcissism. You know, it really is that armchair diagnosis, and everybody's throwing it around every time people find themselves in disagreement. Um, the term narcissism gets thrown out there. I want to talk about that a little bit. Um, so, narcissism is a medical diagnosis, and not everybody in the world is a narcissist. However, like if you are reading in online spaces, it would be quite easy to believe that like pretty much everybody has this diagnosis, right? And um I do believe there's a pretty good reason for that. And that's something that I want to dive into a little bit. Um and that is that as a society, um well, first, I'm going to define narcissism a little bit. Not that I don't think you all know exactly what it is, but um, narcissism is really hallmarked by an inability to empathize with others, an inability to feel or understand from the perspective of others. Um, so it's my feeling that the reason that we've gotten here, that we're pointing our fingers at everybody's saying narcissist, narcissist, is actually it's a symptom of the design. And since we began pushing away from emotions, we made emotions incredibly unsocially acceptable. And unsocially acceptable, that does not sound like a word. um I'm probably very wrong there, but that we made emotions so that they're really not socially acceptable. um and we have a couple of different sets of ideas and beliefs around emotions. um it's a little bit sexist. Like, honestly, men are allowed to feel anger, like the one emotion, and women are allowed to feel a lot more feelings. However, if we feel our feelings and express our feelings, then we get labeled as crazy or, you know, other harmful terms that really don't help us to see, explore, understand, feel emotions. Um, and because of this push away from emotions, what we've effectively done is created a premise where it's really hard for people to see, feel, hear, understand from the perspective of somebody else. And that's going to mirror narcissistic behaviors. So while I don't actually think that everybody's a little bit narcissistic, because that is actually quite problematic, like I was saying in the beginning, narcissism is a medical diagnosis, and there's a lot of really good people out there who have a narcissism medical diagnosis, and they do their work so they're not projecting that onto other people and hurting other people. Now, there's a lot of them that aren't doing their work, and they are projecting it onto other people, and they are hurting other people. But when we get into these mental health terms and just like blanket diagnosing everybody, it's actually really hurtful to all the people out there that are trying to do their work, and that they're not mirroring all of these harmful, hurtful behaviors, and they're doing better and treating their loved ones better. And so, um, the armchair diagnosis itself, just, sitting back, and anytime we disagree or we think we spot a lack of empathy or anything like that, we want to throw out this armchair diagnosis. Oh, they're a narcissist. And then, it kind of ends there. Um, However, having said all of that, um, and I do want to acknowledge that while the armchair diagnosis isn't helpful, there are a lot of people mirroring those narcissistic behaviors and traits. And there are a lot of people having experiences with people who are either diagnosably a narcissist or have a lot of like perceptible narcissistic traits. And when we're managing dealing with somebody who, regardless of diagnosis, is coming off mirroring a lack of empathy, doesn't have a lot of deep understanding, all of that other stuff, as a human being, that's really a painful thing to be on the receiving end of. And in that sense, the term narcissism being used in the, I guess, in the context it's used outside of diagnosis, right? I suppose could be a little bit more helpful to share with others what your experience may feel like from where you're sitting. Because it's something that we all understand. It's something that we all have had some kind of an experience with. Most people have come across somebody who was treating them in very narcissistic ways. So it is very relatable experience just to be able to say, hey, I had this narcissistic kind of an experience with somebody. And it tells a lot without having to get into great detail to get to the point, right? So I suppose in that way it kind of has its place, though I wish there was a different way that we were talking about and expressing that. Um, but now that I've prefaced it all with kind of my thoughts and ideas about narcissism, um, I just wanted to talk a little bit about navigating those experiences because, well, personally, I've had plenty of experiences myself with people who would definitely, fit that bill, and at least the broader ideas around it, if not a diagnosis, because that's not mine to be throwing around, right? But I really want to talk about those experiences and ways that we can navigate those experiences in somewhat healthy ways and keep ourselves safe in as safe as possible in a situation that might be a little bit harder to navigate. And so um I think it's important that once we kind of identify that that's what we feel like we're dealing with, and again, regardless of any diagnosis, it's certainly the term being used in the way that it is now, it certainly can highlight and describe experiences that a lot of people understand. And so we have a lot of mainstream ways and ideas on how to deal with somebody who may be behaving in these ways. Um, One of those is gray rocking. And I do find gray rocking to be a pretty useful tool because narcissists will prey on emotions and perceived weaknesses, or things that emotions as in things that you really care about, what is really important to you. And Um, Gray rocking can be a way to set our boundaries and limits without really engaging and help us keep a distance, because as soon as we become emotionally compromised, they ramp up. Um, the idea of gray rocking is pretty basic. It's like we're not like silent treatment and completely blocking somebody out. With gray rocking, you would take a more kind of a middle area where you are responding, engaging, talking, but you're not adding any emotional context behind it, not allowing yourself to become emotionally charged. And your engagement would be very minimal, as in, oh yeah, interesting, cool. And then, moving on. And not adding to the conversation, not adding more words or trying to have a discussion or any of that stuff. And it's just like, the basic enough engagement so that you're not ignoring somebody. Because if you're ignoring somebody who's exhibiting these traits, that can also be an escalator. And that's kind of why I wanted to talk about this, because people who are exhibiting these traits and people who are particularly actually narcissistic, when we begin to reclaim our own power, that escalates their behavior a lot. And that's not to say that it's our fault that they're escalating. It's definitely their fault. And they're like doing these contortions to try and regain that sense of power and control in the situation. So, um, gray rocking is a method of simply engaging just enough that things don't escalate, and kind of trying to block out anything that would be, bigger or intense, and not engaging in any of the things that might cause us pain or that we would get upset about, or, keep the thing going on a deeper level. So, and I do find that one to be a fairly helpful tool, particularly, once we have a little bit of distance between ourselves and somebody who behaves in these narcissistic manners towards us, um, gray rocking really helps us to hold that boundary and to keep that distance. Sometimes, like when you're still living it and you're still in the situation, like you haven't gotten a little bit of distance between you and the person, and there's a lot of that emotional back and forth still going on, then sometimes it can be kind of hard to achieve. And a lot of times, it like if you're still really immersed in it, like you're living with this person and you're trying to do the gray rock thing, a lot of times, because they're narcissistic and they don't respect boundaries, they might just be kind of steamrolling your boundary and going further and further and further into trying to upset you. So sometimes it's not nearly as effective as others, but once we have a little bit of a distance between ourselves and the narcissistic, it's a lot more often than not effective, or effective. Yes. More frequently than not, it's effective once we have distance. And, it is effective when we don't have distance, though sometimes it can be a little bit harder. Ugh, stumbling all over my language today. All right. So, and then there's a few other things that a lot of people recommend that I've noticed seem to be really extreme escalators. And it seems, um, for myself and my situations, and dealing with the people that I've been dealing with throughout my life, that some of these things could use a little bit of reworking and maybe a different perspective in how we're looking at it. And I've spoken about this with several people going through similar situations, and all of them have reported back similarly that the main narrative of, like, having really firm boundaries, not engaging in a lot of conversation, perhaps engaging 100% over text, and shutting everything down with, I won't allow this, right? Or basically, it's like taking grave rocking to that next level to where it's more like a complete shutout. Um, and again, if we're still in a living situation with somebody who is exhibiting these behaviors, I've seen that escalate really quickly, and I've seen it get pretty ugly pretty fast, because this person is used to feeding off of you, and they know who you are. So they know your triggers. They know what upsets you. They know what makes you sad, and they know what hurts you and what makes you mad. And if you're completely trying to shut them out, a lot of times that really freaks them out. And so they'll continue to push and push and push until they find that one trigger. Like, and I've seen it before where the uh, I want to use words like aggressor, and I just don't like words like that, but where, like, the narcissistic personality type will be just running through a litany of topics. Like, they'll start with one thing that might bother somebody and they can't get a rise. And so they just say something else that's, a whole new topic, but they know that that bothers that person, or that that's something that upsets them. And so um, they'll just keep doing that. They'll be like, okay, I'll say this, and nothing happens. And so they say something else and nothing happens. And they say something else and nothing happens. And they'll just keep going and going and going until somebody just finally goes, knock it off. And suddenly they've found their escalator, right? And so I've found in these situations, especially when we are consciously and awarely trying conscious and aware and trying to get away from a specific situation, we're trying to get distance between ourselves and that person. And, like, it's not easy to get distance between ourselves and somebody who has these narcissistic traits. And so um I've found that in these time periods, that if we do a little bit more, know exactly how to put it. It's like firm boundaries and kind of appeasing. If we choose not to engage in any of the disagreement, if they're adding us with things that they know upset us, or if they're, bringing up topics to try and have a discussion around something that, generally goes south and things like that. If we can avoid engaging in those conversations, and at the same time, anytime that we can, if we can throw out things that help them to feel safe, by proxy, they're not doing the things that they do. And that helps to maintain the safety level that we're experiencing at that time. So I found that when possible, agreeing with them, just being like, oh yeah, that, no, that actually makes sense. Exploring their thoughts a little bit more. Oh, did you want to explain that one to me a little bit? And again, not the hurtful things, not when they're like, oh yeah, I think you XYZ. Um, those aren't the things that we want to explore. But some of their ideas, like some of the things they say that maybe we, aren't really that keen on or something. But if we're able to just hear them out and listen to them and engage with them in conversation. What it does is it sets a platform for the peaceable times. And what we're trying to do once we've identified that we're like dealing with a narcissist, we're in a narcissistic relationship, our parent is a narcissist, or, whoever is a narcissist, or exhibiting really intense narcissistic behaviors, like, it's hard because we don't always go straight to cutting somebody out of our lives, which sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't get to that place where we're actually going to cut somebody out of our lives. And a lot of stops along the ways with people is finding the ways that we can set up boundaries. I talk a lot about how boundaries are the distance from which we can love somebody safely. And so, the process around that, like once we've identified that this person in our lives that we love and care about is more harmful to us than they are good, then it really becomes about getting the distance, getting ourselves to the distance where we can love that person from safely. And sometimes the answer to that is a complete cutoff. And sometimes we're in a position where we can just cut somebody off. We're like, okay, this person has treated me wrong and I'm done. We're not going to call. We're not going to talk. It's over. Maybe 5 years down the road, we'll revisit it. Right now, this is not going to happen. I don't know. It depends on who the person is. um, but a lot of times that's just not the case. More often than not, this is somebody that we live with. This is somebody that is in our close proximity, somebody that we spend multiple days a week with, somebody that we rely on, somebody that, we've been sharing life's responsibilities with and things like that. And so more often than not, this isn't just somebody that we can be like, okay, I've identified that this relationship is really unhealthy and I'm stepping out 100%. And a lot of times too, even if we could without all of the like we're doing life with somebody and all the things that entails, even if we can just step out of a relationship, sometimes it's not really what we want. Like if our mother is a not narcissist, we don't just want to make the decision that we're not going to spend time with our mother ever again anymore. That's a really hard decision to make. An incredibly hard decision to make. And so finding ways along the way that we can get that safe distance between people and ourselves so that we can continue to love them is really huge and powerful and strongly important to so many of us. Like, which is why I get kind of frustrated with a lot of these conversations that you see like around toxic people and toxic family members and all of that. And like the rhetoric is like either we get along and people are all doing their work, which is so far from reality. Like, I have a huge family and of like 30 people, like 3 of them are doing their work. That's a really low percentage rate. Really, like, and if we're to completely just get distance between ourselves and everybody who behaves in certain ways, it's kind of lonely over there. And so, finding the ways that we can safely set up the boundaries and the distance and all of that stuff is super important and valuable. So, um, a little distracted, but I bring myself back around there. You know, I feel like a lot of people, because the mainstream rhetoric is like, we set these firm boundaries, and if they, try to cross our boundaries, we set the boundaries again this way, and we just keep it and double down. And so many times, like I was saying, I've seen that go poorly. And what I recommend is a combination One second here. I'm a little stuffy. All right. So what I recommend is kind of a combination between like the gray rocking concept and helping this person to feel a little bit less dysregulated or a little bit less fearful in the relationship that they have with us. And we do that by validating the things that they're saying when we can, agreeing with the things that they're saying when we can. And that's like I'm saying, it's like we don't always have to agree with them. If they're saying something that's horrible and mean and terrible, that's like we don't have to do that. That's not what I'm saying. But when they say things that kind of align with us, if we just say, hey, I agree with you, it's amazing how much that calms the headspace they're in, and then they're not like coming at you anymore. And so if we're able to be emotionally withdrawn and at the same time pretty validating, listening, hearing, understanding, we can create a certain amount of distance where they're moved back from our emotional space, but they're not mad about it, because they haven't felt the shut out feeling that makes them want to come in and essentially try and break you down to the level where they can manipulate and take advantage of you again. And, you know, that is the cycle and the goal with a narcissistic abuser type is like, if you seem balanced, that's when they're going to knock you off balance. But then when they knock you off balance, you become kind of a danger to them because you're angry, because you're hurt, because you might point out the things to them, or you might tell other people, or you might leave them, or all of these other things that are going on in their head because they're not looking from your point of view. That's not the narcissistic MO, isn't seeing things from your point of view. Like literally, they can only feel from their point of view. And so, from their point of view, when they've been bullying you and poking at you, then you have kind of become a danger to them in their perspective because it's all about them. That's what narcissism is about. And so they poke you and poke you and poke you until they perceive you as a danger. And that was the goal all along. Oof, what a total like mind fuck. Like seriously, OMG. That is really hard stuff to process. Like gaslighting at its like peak. Um so a part of the ways that we keep ourselves safe is not getting into that emotional roller coaster with them, right? It's that emotional ride. And that's what they're feeding off of, is the emotional roller coaster, the highs and the lows, the disconnect, and then the love bombing and all of that stuff. And so through being, like I said, like the concept of gray rocking, where we're emotionally reserved, we're feeding into the conversation at the bare minimum, And when we're doing that, we're doing it from a really loving, understanding perspective where we're like, I get you. You make sense. I understand you. And again, when it's like personal attacks, then we're just like, go fall back more towards the gray rocking and towards the like, okay, I'm not going to get like caught up in this and emotionally involved. And those would be times when we wouldn't be like, yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, that's great. But then, um, we can kind of ride the thing that way. And one thing that I found, especially with helping people through divorce with a narcissist, is that um, it really helps keep things from the narcissist escalating things to the next level. Um, and as a narcissist loses control, the more they're going to try and like do the contortions and the control moves and all of those things to try and get the control. That's why so many of the behaviors of like so many of the behaviors I'm going to say of like men during divorce, they say the exact same things. They'll be like, you're crazy and you'll never see your kids again. And we're talking like hundreds of thousands of women have had this experience where when they're going through divorce, and a lot of times somebody will come to me and they'll be like, yeah, it's been really hard and he's been acting these certain ways, and I'll be able to like almost verbatim be like, oh, so he says things like this, and they're looking at me going, wow, how'd you know? I'm like, because it's like stock edition and they all do. You're not alone. And um, so, because of that, like, it actually makes it easy because there's stock edition behaviors. There's a certain MO and a set of behaviors that people will be engaging with in. It makes it really easy to break it down and be like, okay, so if we're seeing a like block set of these behaviors, then how can we step out of these behaviors and do something different so that everybody in this situation remains safe? And um, if you're dealing with somebody, like I said at the beginning, how like it's the armchair diagnosis. Everybody going around calling everybody that they don't like narcissistic. Anytime they get into a disagreement, they're having a narcissistic disagreement. While that isn't true, there really are a lot of people out there having experiences with somebody who is either a bona fide narcissist or they are definitely exhibiting a lot of narcissistic behaviors. And so, if that's something that you're experiencing, it's like the first step is in acknowledging and seeing it so that we can start to do something different, so that we can remove ourselves from the situation through holding ourselves accountable for the role we play and um, finding the ways to step back from that without escalating it any more than possible. And like I was mentioning before, it's like when we find ourselves in these situations, they slowly become that way. And we just wake up one day and we realize how bad they've gotten. Um, and a lot of times, it's not just something that we go, okay, well, this was terrible and I'm just going to cold turkey this person. And so we are tasked with working really hard to find ways to keep ourselves safe along the way. And in some situations, I did want to say, like in the situation of divorce from a narcissist, that narcissist is really going to be trying really hard to regain control. And so once they realize this is final, once they realize that you've decided that you're not coming back and that you're absolutely leaving and all of that, the next thing they're going to do is go and try and use the legal system to try and hurt you. And so if you are in that kind of a situation where you're like stepping out of a narcissistic relationship and kids are involved, I strongly recommend, and I don't actually recommend like hiring a lawyer and going to court. We, do some lawyer consultations for sure, because you can get free consultations. But what I do recommend is getting the paperwork, because as soon as you have the paperwork, then they can't use that. And that is going to be the ultimate control move, that they'll have to be able to control you even after you've decided that you're going to no longer be controlled. And that's particularly in the case of divorce with children. Sometimes even without children, they'll have ways in divorce where they can like still manipulate you. But if you're married to a narcissist, or to anybody, if you're married, then, you can just, in your divorce your divorce paperwork, go ahead and get that finalized as soon as possible. Then there's a custody agreement right in there. You can fill out that custody agreement. If you're not married, for a fraction of the cost of hiring a lawyer, you can hire a court appointed moderator, and a court appointed moderator will help you write that paperwork in accordance with your state laws. And once we have things like that finalized, they can't come at us anymore. And we think, we're like, oh, maybe we don't need all of that, and maybe we'll just get along and we'll share, because I don't want to hurt my kids, and I don't want to keep them from their other parent, and all of these other things. And they're thinking power and control, power and control. This person can't leave, they can't do what they want to do, they can't XYZ if I keep the courts involved, right? And so in fact, getting that paperwork filed with the courts and in writing, if it's huge. And then again, we can go back to any variation of solid 100% no, we're not talking anymore, any of that stuff. Or we can do different variations of like trying to set new boundaries and having a different kind of a relationship with more distance between it with this person. And whatever you decide, however you decide you're going to navigate such a situation, it's all valid. You don't have to cut anybody out of your life 100%. You don't have to hate or dislike somebody because they're exhibiting these traits or any of those things. Like, if you're feeling like you want to continue trying to hold somebody like this in your life at any level, that is a completely valid decision. You have your reasons, and you don't have to explain that to anybody. And it is a hard road, and you might need some help and support along the way, and finding ways to hold yourself at an emotional distance so that you're not getting hurt, or getting the least amount of hurt as possible in a really difficult situation, is like super empowering and powerful. And like I said, whatever you decide and whatever it is that you're navigating, it's all valid. It's like, we don't want to just completely cut a spouse or the parent of our children out of our lives. We don't want to completely cut our own parents out of our lives, or our siblings, a lot of times. And so if we're navigating through something like this, it is totally valid to take your time with it, to keep the person around, and it's totally valid to not take your time with it and have a firm boundary that leads to, nothing from this point on out. So hopefully that all makes sense and it's helpful, and y'all get a good takeaway from that. And feel free, of course, to ask any questions about it when we get into the sharing portion. So I'm going to shut off the recording and get to the sharing portion of the call. And wow, it's 10:45. How did I talk that long?